Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. Today we're going to talk about the interesting technical features and quirks of this 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado. Now, the Toronado was introduced in 1966. That was the inaugural model year for this particular vehicle. And, it sold pretty well. It sold almost 40,000 units in its first year between the standard Toronado and the deluxe Toronado. There were two models. This is a deluxe Toronado, although there aren't many deluxe options associated with it. And this was one of three E-body cars that General Motors would introduce for 1966 and 1967. The other was the 66 Riviera, and then the final was the 1967 Eldorado. They're all based on the same platform, which amazingly spawned front-wheel drive vehicles, the Toronado and the Eldorado, and rear-wheel drive vehicles, the Riviera, and completely different chassis underneath as well. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But first, a few details about the Toronado. Now, it's pretty awesome. Oldsmobile was always GM's technology division. Remember, they had introduced the overhead valve V8 in 1949 along with Cadillac, helped engineer the hydromatic transmission, and I guess the division managers really wanted something for the 1966 model year that stood out. And remember, Ford had had so much success in 1958 by converting its Thunderbird to a four-place Thunderbird that in General Motors they were looking for something similar. This was, after all, the era where the personal luxury coupes were really taking off after that Thunderbird. So Buick got the Riviera in 1963. And the first generation Riviera would run from 63 to 65. The second generation would start in 1966. And Oldsmobile was admittedly a bit jealous. They had actually bid on the design for that 63 Riviera, which, by the way, was originally styled as a LaSalle. It was supposed to be a LaSalle, but Buick Studio ended up winning out to produce it over over Oldsmobile and Pontiac Studios, because they agreed to keep the design unaltered, and Olds and Pontiac wanted to make some changes. But you can tell it was styled as a LaSalle because you'll see this very linear blade-like grille on either side of the 63 Riviera, just like the 1940 LaSalle. So the Toronado was introduced in 1966 as Oldsmobile's response really to that Riviera, which was a response to the 58 Thunderbird. And well, the distinguishing feature of the Toronado is really these pronounced wheel arches and the line that would go all the way down the car here. By the way, I have to say, if you're interested to learn more about the Toronado history, be sure to pick up a copy of Dick Russin's book called Designing Dreams. I'll put a link in the description because it describes the Toronado history and you see a ton of images about it. And I've even written a chapter in it. And I'm doing a video on this. I don't know how much longer I'm going to have this Toronado. There's a buyer who wants it, so I guess I'll enjoy it for its waning days. But this is finished in a color called Autumn Bronze as well, which is my favorite color for the Toronados, and the interior is of the same exact color. So it's pretty cool. In any case, when this was introduced in 1966, it had a hefty base price. The standard Toronado cost about $4,600. The deluxe Toronado, $4,800. And that was the standard price without any options. So no air conditioning, no power windows, no nothing. This is a deluxe model. The base price was $4,800, which is the equivalent of about $48,000, $49,000 today. So very expensive. If you added air conditioning and any power options, you were pushing mid-50s, maybe in close to $60,000. And just for reference, the 66 Riviera, the base price was $4,400. So the deluxe Toronado was $200 more expensive than the base Riviera, which kind of broke the so-called GM Sloan ladder. In other words, the pricing between all the divisions should have a little bit of spread. Normally, Buick would be more expensive than Oldsmobile, but here, the Oldsmobile was in fact a little bit more expensive than the Riviera. Now, in terms of the interesting features of this, the first thing is that there's a lot of shared components between the Riviera, Toronado, and Eldorado. This A-pillar here is shared between all three cars, the front windshield, as well as the front glass. I believe the door inners are also shared. The roof panel is different on the Eldorado than the Riviera and the Toronado, but this roof panel is shared across the Rivi and the Toronado. And it's interesting because this quarter panel kind of starts somewhere in this region, but this line that you see that starts at the roof is the exact same on the Riv. And then of course here on the Toronado it comes down from the roof all the way. The Riv has its own separate kind of form in the rear. Here you just have this extremely pronounced wheel arch that's caused because the front fender, if you notice, is perfectly vertical, but then the car kind of rotates, and back here this portion of the body is sweeping inside, and so you have to have a more pronounced wheel arch here. I mean, it's just a massive wheel arch so that it can kind of sit in line with the front wheel arch. So this wheel arch is actually bigger than that one. And the Toronado is, let's say, one of these cars that you can see it here. Most cars taper inward as they go rearward, but this actually flares outboard, which I don't think is aerodynamic, but who really cared back in 1966? It's an interesting look. I don't think there's many cars that do that flare outboard, especially nowadays. But it works because you have these distinctive fender flares and the C-pillar is kind of laid over. It's just one unbroken form here with the C-pillar all the way down, and then just organically fillets into this huge wheel arch. Of course, you have this pronounced crease here. But an absolutely beautiful design. And remember, GM designers did this sharing this line in the roof. Also shares, I believe, the backlight with the Riv. Interestingly, they both have this tulip panel or Dutchman panel for the flow-through ventilation system. These are one of the early cars that GM did with flow-through ventilation and no vent windows. Remember, vent windows were still super popular. But on the Riv, there's only 2 slots on this tulip panel. On the Toronado, it's 4. So why they thought people would know or care about the difference, I don't know. And you can imagine one of the great or unfortunate things about this is that leaves and debris and all that stuff falls in here and then would clog the tubes in the trunk, and then you get water in the trunk, etc., etc. Not good. It does appear, I would say, that the vent or the drainage system is different underneath this tulip panel between the Toro and the Riv. The Riv, it extends all the way out here, and they had little kind of like a grill almost to protect things from going down in here. But the Toro is using a little bit different setup. Now, the other thing that the Toronado has, which the other 2 cars don't have, is this very chopped off rear. And you'll see a lot of commonality here in the theme between the front and the rear. Notice the very rectilinear tail lamp theme. By the way, only on the 66. The 67 would have this egg crate theme that would be replicated also in the front. And if we go up to the front, you'll notice that theme right here. Very similar to, in some ways, the coffin nose cords, the cord 810, 812, especially the wheels, which picked that up. This car doesn't have many options, but it does have the optional deluxe bright wheels. You'll notice the drum is visible behind there, and the 66 Toronado you could not get disc brakes on. And one of the things about this car is it's got a 385 horsepower, 425 cubic inch V8 was standard. That was Oldsmobile's top V8. You could only get the 385 horsepower in the Toronado. Other cars, the top engine was the 375 horsepower Starfire V8. But this car is pretty fast and has a high top speed, 120, 125 probably. And the brakes just really weren't up to the task. Despite this fact that this was a somewhat smaller car than the full-size cars, the brakes really aren't any larger, and it weighs, in fact, a little bit more despite it being smaller. So the brakes are a little overtaxed relative to the power that the engine makes. Now you do have this beautifully integrated rear backup light into the bumper. One other piece of trivia is that the Oldsmobile designers wanted to have dual outlet exhausts on both sides, 4 exhaust tips, and they actually wanted them vertically oriented, but the bean counters got to that and said no way. And I think Fisher Body Division, who did the bumpers, also said that's going to be too hard to affect the vertical tailpipes because you would interfere with the bumper structure behind that. Now, as we go up here, one of the things you'll notice about the Toronado is this huge front end overhang. And despite the fact that the car shares so much with the 66 Riviera, as I mentioned, the overhang and the length of the front is actually longer on the Toronado than it is on the Riviera. There's some pictures that were taken in General Motors styling studios back in the day that show a clay model with half of it is the Toronado and half of it is the Riviera, and you'll see how much longer the Toronado is in the front. And of course you have this bladed fender. You could never get away with this today. This is just about ready to slice a pedestrian open if they were to hit it. I mean, this point here, actually that's a very sharp point. You could cut yourself on that. It's not really flashing there. It's just a very sharp crease on the bumper and a sharp crease here on the fender. Again, you'd never see this today, but that's what makes this so cool. Now you have the pedestrian impact standard, so every car has this very tall, grille and hood, so that if you hit someone, they roll up in a controlled manner on the hood. I'm not kidding, by the way. There is truly a pedestrian impact standard. And of course, there's aerodynamics. This would be terrible for aerodynamics because you get vortices in this area here that would get caught. Oh well, it looks cool. Now, there's a couple themes going on here in the front end. You have the so-called W theme. If you look at this car from above, you can see it's an inverted W here, out to this point and back. Very popular for cars of this era, especially GM cars. You have the so-called barbell theme where the edges of the car are wider than the midsection. That was something that the designers were trying to do on Oldsmobiles of the era. And for 1 year only, you have these little eyebrows over the hidden headlamps. 67, they would get rid of those. And I love the eyebrows. I think it just accentuates the barbell theme up front. And this was the first Oldsmobile with hidden headlamps. And I think until the Toronado was redone in 1986, by the way, if you look at the 86 Toronado, it kind of riffs off this theme with this very long linear theme up front, and probably stole the idea for the hidden headlamps too. This was the first and only Oldsmobile with hidden headlamps at the time. Like I said, until I believe the 86 Toronado came out, which had them as well. Of course, you have the rocket logo here for Oldsmobile, which is actually fashioned in the shape of the Lincoln logo. That was what Oldsmobile designers used to come up with this logo. So why not rob from a luxury mark? You're not going to take from Cadillac. You don't want to steal from your own at General Motors. But you can create the rocket logo out of the out of the Lincoln logo. And of course, Oldsmobile had the rocket engines. Now, another thing I will say about this car is this A-pillar is shared between the Riv, the Aldo, and the Toro. And it was going to be more pronounced originally, but then it was felt that if it were more pronounced, it was going to be so easy to distinguish that the cars were all shared. So one of the things the designers did was tone this down so it wasn't as pronounced, so that you didn't see that the car shared the A-pillar. And I have to say, it's a beautiful A-pillar, but you don't really notice that the cars have so much shared because of it. This, by the way, is a car with no bone line at all. Bone lines, my designer friends some of them are going to ping me. The most strict definition I've heard of a bone line is really, you'll see a car with a surface that has a radius just like a bone, kind of this rather dull radius. Unfortunately, I don't have a vehicle that has a bone line here, but I'll put a picture of one. There are a number of vehicles that have that, and this car doesn't have anything like that. And there's really not much to the overall body side, aside from this beautiful you know, fender arch and wheel flare, and then the line that goes that entire length of the car. This car, I mentioned it has the optional wheels. It has the optional cornering lamps as well, which my friend Mr. Jim Hall knows it all. Be sure to check out his channel with Craig Cole, Auto Esoterica. He has a number of series called Jim Hall Knows It All, and he doesn't know it all, but he knows quite a bit. He doesn't like these because he would want this to sit flush with the body, and I agree with him. But you can see it sits slightly proud of the body here. I think they just did that for manufacturability. But it is kind of cool. It's like this shark gill, very similar to what was on the Mako shark concept. Of course, this doesn't have moving louvers like that concept did. It does have a manual antenna, no power antenna in this car. You got to manually raise and lower the mast. That was how this worked back in the day. Now let's take a look inside. We're going to go, you'll see why this is off. By the way, that's an exclusive Toronado air cleaner. Wasn't used on any other Oldsmobile or other car. And here we have the deluxe interior for the Toronado. There were a couple different variants of this, where in some cases the pull strap was not aligned with that Brightwork trim. But here it is, and this is a so-called dipped interior because the interior is the same color as the exterior. And to my eye, it's just fantastic. I love the door panel. You, of course, have the front and rear door handles that you can get out on either side, and that's for the rear passenger. No seat back locks. You just move it forward. There's decent room back here for the rear seat passengers. But the Toronado had this interesting theme here to the dash where this was always black, and you got this floor mat that was integrated into the carpet. So it's actually trimmed into the carpet. And the true way that you can know if your carpet set is original is if you still have this, because oftentimes people replace the carpet and that is gone. But this is how it was done. You notice I have a little split in my rubber mat. Oh well. But the carpet's in great shape. And this car is a no AC car. You could get just the standard controls like you see there. Ventilation, heating, air conditioning would be here if it were manual air. And then there was Comfortron that you could get that was optional. So I love this. This is just a dummy wheel here. I think that was for the dial a cruise. If you got cruise control. This is a tilt telescoping wheel, beautiful wheel. This is optional as well. You turn this ring, and then you can move the wheel in and out. And then you just turn it again to lock it. So that's another option on this car. As you see, no power windows. I mentioned no AC, no power seat, but a beautifully sculpted little handle down here that you can move back and forth to move the bench seat. And it does have an AM radio. Everything was optional. But the Toronado also had this rotating drum speedometer, like you saw, that gave, as Oldsmobile said, instantaneous readouts. And I have to say I like it. The Riviera also had this. The Eldorado did not. The Eldorado just had a kind of standard speedometer with a horizontally sweeping needle. Beautifully styled gear shift and turn signal lever and tilt wheel. And despite the fact that you don't have AC in this car, you still did get the vent here and the vent there. So a rare car where when you push the ventilation here on maximum, you can see it says min, medium, and max, you get the ventilation coming out of these vents as well, as opposed to just the lower kickwell vent. That was very rare. Now, one thing about the Toronado I will have to say is the interior in general, and Car Life, when they tested the car back in 1966, noticed this. The interior is not that well screwed together. Of the Riviera, Eldorado, and the Toronado, unfortunately, the Toronado, I think on the Car Life car, it was already shedding parts and it was brand new. And that's probably the biggest letdown of this car. The interior, I think, looks great. There's nothing to complain about in terms of the seats and the seating comfort. But in particular, the door panels are pretty rattly. And it's like they were designed in from the factory with rattles. And that was noted way back, like I said, when the cars were new by Car Life. So it's not a function of age. It's just a function that they were not that well engineered. I'll say my Riv and Eldorado, there's no rattle in the door panels. So Oldsmobile, despite the fact they did great engineering on the engine and transmission on this, well, on the interior, they left something to be desired in terms of how it was screwed together. But hey, at least it looks good. Of course, the rear package shelf. This vinyl has just this beautiful sheen to it, like a pearlescent sheen. I wish they did that. I wish they made interiors with many different colors anymore, but of course they don't do that either. And I love the activation of these buttons. Listen to the sound. I mean, no plastic crap here. Just very firm and positive. Let's turn on the headlights so you can see those. I think I got enough vacuum. This car holds vacuum really well. So just turn the headlamps on. And there they go. The little frog. This car still has, I think, all the T3 headlights. T3. Oh, one's been replaced. Long time ago. That one's still a T3 headlight. And we'll put it back down. And there they go. I will say the doors close pretty well, at least with no effort. This car, the Toronado, as opposed to the Riv and the Aldo, the door checks on this Toronado are pretty much non-existent. They're there, but you got to be careful if you park this car on a hill and you open the door, because the door is going to come flying back at you. It's pretty weak door checks, but you can just touch the door and it closes. Ooh, the sun's peeking out. Perfect timing. There you go. You can see the beautiful autumn bronze color. Oh boy, got a little dusty. Look at that. Yeah, fantastic. You can see the interior too in the sunlight. Oh, my favorite color on this car. Like an orangey, reddish color. And here, look at the interior. Just comes alive. Wow. All right. Let's take a look under hood. Now, I mentioned this car came with a 425 cubic inch, 385 horsepower V8 exclusive to the Toronado. And what you'll find here is one of the few cars where the intake manifold is actually kind of sunk. It dips down as opposed to being raised. Of course, racers wanted raised intake manifolds. Here you have the opposite because of the low hood height and trying to package this under the hood. Of course, you have the wonderful Rochester Quadrajet carburetor with the tremendously large secondaries there. And one of the things that you have that existed until 1967 model year, this is for the transmission, this is the kickdown switch and also the switch for the switch pitch converter. This turbohydromatic 425 has a variable pitch stator in it and 2 stall speeds. So there's more of an economy stall speed, and then as you accelerate harder and harder, it seems like the transmission downshifts, but it actually doesn't. It's just changing the stall speed. That would go away after 1967. I think it's only on turbohydromatic 400s, 425s for 65, 6, and 7. That would also exist on some Dynaflows and other GM transmissions. But in terms of the big transmissions like this, and this is a huge transmission. Look at that transmission mount there. It's basically a turbohydromatic 400 that has the torque converter here, and then you have a Morse high-vo chain that turns the rest of the transmission, which is pointing this way, and it connects into a final drive up here. And then look at these half shafts. Super beefy half shafts. Now, the other thing that's weird about the Toronado in terms of its chassis, oh, look at that paint. Wow. Yeah. Is the rear suspension and the frame. This car has a 3/4 length frame and a leaf spring, a single leaf rear. See, that's the leaf spring right there. One leaf. And it's kind of goofy. I don't know why they did that, but they did. And it doesn't have a full frame. So the Riviera actually has an X frame underneath it, totally different from the Toronado and Eldorado. There's 4 shocks in the rear as well, 2 to locate the axle from moving front and back, and then 2 to absorb the shocks up and down. Another kind of rare setup. That setup was used pretty rarely and mostly on economy cars. Some lower end economy cars that GM had that monoleaf rear. It didn't really belong on a $50,000 car. And as a consequence, another thing that is a letdown in this car is the ride. Same with the Eldo. The Riviera rides way, way better. Riviera also has Buick's Alfin drum brakes, which were much better than this too. Now this engine, the astute observer will notice, is actually not original to this Toronado, amazingly. This is actually, if you go by the casting code, a 1970 Toronado V8. And, well, what happened to the original V8 in this car? I don't know, but this is actually not a junkyard engine. This is a factory Oldsmobile service replacement block. And for whatever reason, in 1970, this car must have had an engine issue. Some of the 425s in 1966 did. And you can tell the old service replacement blocks because down here in that area, there's a little pad where there's a serial number there. And if there's no serial number, it's an Oldsmobile service replacement block. So this engine's actually been replaced, and it's a 455 from 1970. So I've got a little bit more torque than this car would have stock. And I don't know, kind of makes the car interesting. Yeah, it's not a muscle car. You're not looking for necessarily numbers matching, although probably that would be good. But this isn't just somebody took a junkyard engine and dumped it in here. This was actually, like I said, a Oldsmobile service replacement block. So it was done at the dealer back then. And the car doesn't have many miles. It has 57,000 miles on it now. So I don't know how many miles it had when that was done. But another little piece of trivia. So let's take it for a brief spin so you can see the rotating drum on the instrument panel. All right, so we're going to button it up and take it for a drive. Now, I have to say everything works on this car. I don't know what this is for. If anybody knows what this is for, it's just kind of sitting here. Looks like it threads into something. Let me know. Everything seems to work, so I don't know what that is for. Oh well, if you're a Toronado expert, let me know. I do love the hood springs here, are just so crude. But, you know, it works. One last look in the sunlight before we take off. All right. You know, one thing GM always did well in this era, I shouldn't say always, but most of the time was good engines and transmissions, and this is no exception, that is for sure. All right, here we go. You can see the instantaneous readout on the speedometer here, as Oldsmobile called it. The turn signals lights, by the way, in this are pretty weird. Let's see if you... It's got like this, just blinks there. The right is over here. This is the high beam. You have the headlamps on. It says high beam, actually. Oh yeah. That Oldsmobile V8 just sounds so good. They use this powertrain, by the way, in the GMC motorhomes. The Oldsmobile V8 with the turbo-hydromatic 425 transmission. Pretty much unaltered. It tells you how strong it was in this car. Let's go out on the main road. All right, and here we go. Listen to the sound of the Oldsmobile V8. Oh yeah. Oh, just fantastic. Just fantastic. And the view can't be beat. Well, hope you enjoyed this spotlight on this Toronado. Thanks again for watching.